To those of you who are with us today and to those who are watching the recorded webinar at a later date. We're going to begin here in just a few minutes, and I'd like to mention that this webinar will also be live streamed on the Wendland Cook Program Facebook page. So please feel free to share that live stream on your social media platforms. Okay. I want to welcome you to this webinar series that's titled Reproductive and Economic Justice in a Post-Roe Landscape, Changing the Conversation in Christian Communities. We're very much looking forward to an engaged conversation among our panelists, and we invite you to submit comments and questions as we get toward the end of the webinar. These webinars have been designed by a team of scholars and activists who are also moderating the respective panels under the auspices of the Wendland Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt Divinity School. The Wendland Cook Program is concerned about matters of economic and ecological justice, but always with a concern for the intersectionality of oppressions, including racism and sexism. The program investigates how religion can become part of the solution rather than remain simply part of the problem. And those who are most affected by the pressures of our age are not just victims, they are also becoming agents, and they model new forms of solidarity. Other partners and sponsors of this webinar series include In Our Own Voice, the National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, Union Theological Seminary in New York City, Drew Theological School at Drew University, and the Carpenter Program in Religion, Gender, and Sexuality at Vanderbilt Divinity School. My name is Ellen Armour, and I am on the faculty of Vanderbilt Divinity School and direct the Carpenter Program, and I will be moderating the panel tonight. This is our last webinar in this Wendland Cook series. Today's webinar is titled Post-Roe Reproductive and Economic Justice, Thinking Theologically. There is an urgency for progressive churches and individuals to support the broad concerns of reproductive and economic justice. This panel of speakers will offer theological and ethical resources for the interrelated issues of abortion rights, reproductive justice, and empowerment for workers. Contrary to the claims by the far right, Christian communities can, in good faith, support the moral self-determination of pregnant persons seeking an abortion. Abortion rights and reproductive justice are not just issues of sexuality and family building, but are also unavoidably economic issues and sites of labor inequality and exploitation. This panel offers the kind of moral reflection on resistance and agency that Christians committed to justice are seeking. Now, before we jump into the conversation with our experts, let me explain how audience participation will work. Later in the session, we will be able to respond to some of your questions. You can post questions throughout the session using the Q&A function, where you can also vote for a question that someone else has asked. We may not get to all the questions, so we'll try, but we will make an effort to answer questions with the most support first. You can also post comments using the chat function, though please be aware that panelists will likely not be able to respond there. So now let me invite the panelists to join us on screen. Our first panelist is Dr. Rebecca Todd Peters. She's professor of religious studies at Elon University and currently on sabbatical and directing the Abortion and Religion Project. Her book, Trust Women, a Progressive Christian Argument for Reproductive Justice, offers a critique of the current justification framework of the abortion debate and argues for a shift toward reproductive justice. Dr. Sandra Sullivan Dunbar is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Loyola University in Chicago, where she teaches courses in sexual ethics, reproductive justice, and Catholic moral theology. In her book, Human Dependency and Christian Ethics, Dr. Sullivan Dunbar argues that recent Western political and economic theory, as well as recent Christian love theologies, obscure the demands and the moral complexity of caregiving relations in human life. When this webinar was first planned, the Reverend Dr. Carrie Jackson from the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice had agreed to participate. However, she was not able to be with us for this webinar after all. So in her place, we have Dr. Margaret D. Kamitsuka, who is the Francis W. and Lydia L. Davis Professor Emeritus of Religion at Oberlin College in Ohio. Her most recent book is Abortion and the Christian Tradition, a Pro-Choice Theological Ethic, published in 2019. Professor Kamitsuka also serves as the book editor for the American Academy of Religion's Academy Series for New Dissertations. All right, if we're ready then, let's begin. Panelists, I would like to ask you to, each of you to speak for 5 minutes on the following question, and I'll keep time. Can you please share with us your views on why abortion rights and reproductive justice should also be thought of as economic issues? And we'll start with Professor Sullivan Dunbar, then we'll switch to Professor Peters, and then Professor Kamitsuka. Okay, Professor Sullivan Dunbar, please.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, a lot of my work has been relating to the care economy, the so-called care economy. In other words, the economy of people doing the labor that is care, which is labor that was basically written out of the discipline of economics early on. And basically, this has led to poverty for women and children. When economics was developed back in the Industrial Revolution and then the process of commercialization, basically the people developing economics didn't know what to do about caring labor because we started to measure the economy in terms of buying and selling things, and care is not bought or sold for the most part. And so you can see those early economists kind of struggling with what to do about that, but they gave up pretty quickly and they decided to relegate that kind of reproductive labor to the non-economic sphere. And it basically was put into the private sphere. And while the market was considered the realm of rational self-interest, the private sphere, the home, then got theorized as sort of this, where all the altruism goes, and what is appropriate there becomes self-sacrifice and complete other regard. And there's been a couple of, several results of that. One is that the care economy goes unsupported in an economy that's mostly based on money. And like I said, that leads to poverty for women and children. The care economy is deeply undercapitalized. And it also means that people who are privileged resolve that problem by exploiting people who are less privileged. So in the United States, some of our care needs were met by slavery. And then in Jim Crow, they were met by restricting the avenues of employment available to women of color, especially because they did a lot of care work. And now it's a lot of exploitation of migrant workers. So the care economy is a site of exploitation, and that makes it very hard to meet one of the pillars of the reproductive justice movement, which is the ability for everybody to raise their children in a safe and healthy environment, because we have poverty, we have people who are taking care of other people's children instead of their own, et cetera. But the other thing about it is, I think there's a really strong parallel between this idea that caregiving is a site of sacrificial other regard, and if you decide that you're going to introduce self-interest into that, then you become selfish. And the way we think about abortion, because then abortion is also theorized as a self-interested, selfish choice made for convenience, instead of what it really is, which is the decision to pick up a responsibility. And all of us can only take on so many responsibilities, right? The decision to devote some of your time, energy, and material resources to raising another child or raising your first child. We theorize abortion, Heidi's justification paradigm, which I'm sure she'll talk about, suggests that you should always have the child and you have to come up with a good enough reason not to. But I think if we think about this in an economic framework, one of the things that we can see is that, it's more of a positive choosing a responsibility or committing oneself to a responsibility and picking it up instead. And then I would just say, I think that probably my other panelists will say something similar, but we have plenty of research showing, first of all, that it's primarily women who are low income who end up having abortions. That's certainly not the only reason. It's not a fair thing to say that poverty is the only reason why women would ever choose abortion, but it contributes for many. It's not usually the only factor. But also the turned away studies showed that women who want abortions and are turned away have a lot of bad economic outcomes. Like they're 3 times more likely to be unemployed. They're 4 times more likely to be living under the poverty levels. And that shouldn't surprise any of us, given some of the dynamics that I just laid out. And I don't know how many minutes I've taken, but I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's super, super helpful by giving us some larger context and some pushback and too on what's going on. Okay. Professor Peters, please.
Thank you. Yes, just to, build on what Sandy's already been talking about, I think it's really significant that we are talking about using and shifting to the reproductive justice framework, because the point of the there are many points of the reproductive justice framework, but what it does for us is it repositions abortion appropriately within the context of people's fertility and people's reproductive life spans, right? We can, expect that women are pregnant for 2.7 years, either pregnant, trying to get pregnant, or postpartum for 2.7 years out of a 30 plus year of fertility. So there's a very, very long time frame within which there are all sorts of reproductive things going on in people's lives. And so when we talk about reproductive justice, we appropriately take abortion, which is this singular issue that has outsized attention and focus on it, and put it back within the framework of people's lives and people's reproductive decision-making. And I think this is really part of what is so important about shifting to the reproductive justice framework. And again, it's also, I think, not simply that, sort of why should we think of abortion as an economic issue? It is an economic issue, right? Whether we want to think about it or not, it simply is an economic issue. I found a study about 2 years ago that I think HUD had done that documented that each child in a family in the US, you can expect about $10,000 a year. I mean, that is a lot of money. And even if you have more than one, you might think, oh, well, then it would be like half as much for the second. It's not, because childcare expenses don't cut in half when you have a second child. And the poverty line for a family of 2 is 17,000, right? So, I mean, you're talking about very, very large sums of money to raise and care for children, particularly in those first 5 years when you have childcare expenses and diapers and formula and just all sorts of expenses that are very high. So to pick up on Sandy's point around poverty and abortion statistics, I think it's important to recognize that 3/4 of the people having abortions are at the poverty line or 200% of the poverty line. But even more important than recognizing that is to recognize that in the mid-'80s, that was only half of people having abortions, that the numbers have increased dramatically in the last couple of decades. And that has to do not only with the economy, but it also has to do with healthcare, access to contraception, and access to long-acting reversible contraceptives, which have a much higher efficacy rate, lower failure rate. And so what we are seeing is people with access to contraception, with access to good healthcare, are seeing unexpected pregnancies go down. But people without access to those kinds of resources are not having that experience. So it simply is an economic issue. And I think that this also, just sort of one last point I'll make, sort of since this is the theological conversation, as we think about churches, as we think about statements that churches are making about where they stand on the morality of abortion, economics and poverty is often pulled out. and condemned or at least dismissed as an acceptable reason for people choosing to end pregnancies. And that is such a privileged position. Particularly think about sort of the mainline churches, but it's not just the mainline churches. The folks who are making these statements are people who are not recognizing the material reality and challenges and circumstances of people who are navigating those decisions about whether or not to continue a particular pregnancy in the situation that they are in. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Peters. That was really helpful as well. I'm reminded, I heard recently that, and I haven't been able to look this up, but that apparently there is no place in this country where one can live sustainably on the minimum wage. And that, because I was thinking maybe at least in rural areas you can do that, but apparently nowhere in the US. So that's another factor, I'm sure. Professor Kamitsuka, it's your turn.
Thank you. So I want to jump in here and make some just straightforward theological comments about the connections between abortion rights and reproductive justice on the one hand and economics. So first theological point I would make on this issue is that God has a preferential option for the poor. So this is a deep teaching of Roman Catholic liberation theology since the 1960s. And the point is that the church has an obligation to address and respond to the immediate needs of the poor and to the structural injustices that perpetuate those inequalities. So the exploitation of workers and the use of religion to pacify workers is not just a Marxist concern, but it's a Christian concern. This point applies to people in the paid workforce as well as in the unpaid labor done by women and mothers in the home, as Sandy has talked about. So reproductive labor is unpaid labor, and it's often done out of love, sometimes done out of duty, and those are Christian virtues. But pregnancy that is coerced or forced would be antithetical to God's love. Okay, that's the first theological point. Second one is that Christianity is a materialist religion. Its core teachings are not about ideas and not really even about spirituality. Christianity's central message has to do with people's lives, with their bodies, and with their place in the world. And we can't forget that the Christian message began with a real birth in a real woman's body. So the Christian message of salvation is not escape from the body, but living an embodied life. Eating, playing, working, having sex, having babies, not having babies. These are all what living an embodied Christian life means. Now, Christians are supposed to live a communal life that witnesses to the world equality and respect and mutual care, what that's supposed to look like. And that involves economic relations, gender relations, parenting, and all of these kinds of relationships that we have. So economics is part and parcel of Christianity as a materialist embodied religion. Third point that I would make theologically is that for theology to have any relevant economic message, it has to listen to voices from the margins. As I mentioned, liberation theology put the problem of the oppression of the poor on the church's radar screen. Now theologians are struggling to get the oppression of sexual bodies on the church's radar screen. And here I'm thinking about the work of the Argentinian liberation theologian, Marcela Althaus-Reed, who is very relevant on this point. And her book that she wrote, very provocatively and I think appropriately titled Indecent Theology, speaks about this issue. And she said that today's liberation theology needs to be a sexual theology, a theology of economics and desires that have been excluded. Let me repeat that quote. Theology needs to be a sexual theology, a theology of economics and desires that have been excluded. I think the RJ movement, the reproductive justice movement, has brought to our attention 4 sets of desires that have been excluded from American life, and to be frank, have been excluded from the church as well. Now, the RJ platform presents them as rights, but I think of them as desires in Althouse Reed's sense of the term. So these desires are deeply rooted in the human person: the desire to have children, the desire not to have children, the desire to raise children safely, the desire for bodily autonomy. So economics comes into play for anyone attempting to pursue any one of these desires. For the church or society to thwart or impede these essential human desires is not just an infringement of a legal right. That would be an ontological infringement of human personhood. So this would be my theological take on the connections between economics on the one hand and abortion rights and reproductive justice on the other.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Kamitsuka. That really does help as well to bring to mind and reframe how we think about these issues theologically, and how that seamless kind of connection between the economic and the theological is there as soon as you start describing it. We're going to now shift to another question, and I will ask the three of you to again each speak for 5 minutes. And here's the question: can you share with us something you have observed or heard from church folks you interact with regarding how the repeal of Roe v. Wade is affecting their lives and attitudes? And what do you see as challenges facing Christian communities going forward? And this time, Professor Kamitsuka, will start with you and then move to Professor Sullivan Dunbar, and then finally to Professor Peters. So, Professor Kamitsuka.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll jump right back in here. So I'd like to answer that question by talking about two different responses that I've observed. The first one is that it has to do with pro-life Christians who think of them as non-political churchgoers who are trying to bring what they think is a message of compassion to women with so-called crisis pregnancies. Now, these people believe that Christians should not be standing outside abortion clinics with signs that say, you know, please don't murder your baby. This is a different group of people. These folks, most of them are women, are doing things like donating money to crisis pregnancy centers, or maybe they're working with outreach programs at their churches, trying to reach out to women who are facing an abortion decision or having a baby that they didn't plan for. Now, the Dobbs decision threw these pro-life Christians for a loop. One website that I've looked at recently, it's called Pro-Grace, and it is not wildly happy about the repeal of Roe. These pro-life Christians are dismayed by the fear that this has instilled in women. They feel this fear themselves. The website quotes the words of this high school valedictorian in Texas, and you probably heard about her. She ad-libbed her valedictorian speech in order to speak about the reproductive rights situation in her state of Texas. And the website, the Pro-Grace website, quotes her. And let me just give a few sentences from this speech. So Paxton says, "I have dreams and hopes and ambitions. I am terrified that if my contraceptives fail, I'm terrified that if I am raped, then my hopes and aspirations and dreams and efforts for my future will no longer matter." Now, the Pro-Grace blogger who quoted this commented on it, and this is what she said, quote, "We need to stop and really listen to Paxton's fears. She is not exaggerating," close quote. This is a pro-life Christian speaking here. So I'm not saying that the Dobbs decision converted this pro-life blogger to a pro-choice position or to an RJ point of view. But what I'm saying is that the reality is starting to sink in that in some parts of America, women and girls are petrified. These pro-life Christians know that God does not rejoice in women and girls being petrified. What comes of this politically, I can't say. I can't look into the future. But the realization that is growing among these pro-life Christians, I think, is a good thing. The second thing I've heard anecdotally is also one of fear. Women who have had miscarriages and required an emergency D&C are realizing that in this post-Roe reality, all women are being affected, not just women who need abortions, but any woman who needs emergency prenatal care. So if you're hemorrhaging from an incomplete miscarriage, or if you have an ectopic pregnancy, your obstetrical care is now directly affected and perhaps threatened by these vague anti-abortion statutes that are written by extremist anti-abortion legislators. So it's sinking in for many women who have had emergency abortions that if they presented at their local hospital today, they might bleed out or die of sepsis on a gurney in the ER. Now, that is a terrifying thought. And again, it is not good for pregnant people to be terrified. But it is good for pregnancy-capable people to realize that the line between miscarriage and abortion is a very thin one. And pro-life discourses try and insert this wedge between these two groups of people, implying that they're different sets of women. On the one hand, the good mothers who grieve their miscarriages, and on the other hand, the sinful ones who kill their unborn children. But in a post-Roe world, that binary really is dissolving before our eyes. So suddenly, women's ability to access reproductive and obstetrical health care is under threat. So there are not two kinds of women. All pregnancy-capable people need to be in solidarity with each other against the anti-abortion forces that are threatening all bodies that have uteruses.
Thank you. Those are powerful, powerful sentiments. Professor Sullivan Dunbar.
Thank you. I think the first thing I'm going to say is sort of comes off of what Dr. Kamitsuka said just a minute ago, which is something that I've observed is that, or observed right after the decision, was on, like, quote unquote Catholic Twitter, a lot of people saying, okay, now it's time to pivot so that we can provide all sorts of social supports for pregnant women so they can, be okay having their babies. And there's all sorts of problems with that. And the most obvious pointed out one was, well, you could have been working on that all along. But really, a bigger issue is that in getting to the point of overturning Dobbs, to get there, because that is a minoritarian viewpoint, there was a long-term strategy that has destroyed the conditions for the pivot, even if that were a possible solution. In other words, gerrymandering, voter suppression, et cetera. So I'll say that for now. But in terms of my, what I've noticed, I guess I'm in a Catholic environment, and what I have noticed is that where before there was a whole lot of silence, now there is beginning to be more conversation. And I think that, in my environment, I'm pretty sure most people are horrified by Dobbs and support abortion rights. I'm not sure how fully thought out specifics of their views are, but nobody ever talked about it. And I started talking about it several years ago, and I could not tell what other people thought. Everybody was nice to me. I don't live in an environment where I would be shunned for having views that are out of line with the Roman Catholic magisterium, but people didn't necessarily volunteer what they thought. And beginning with SB 8 and more with the draft Dobbs decision, and then with the final Dobbs decision, more and more people are sort of letting out how horrified they are. And I often have this impression of, oh, you're horrified. They seem to think I knew that, but I didn't know that because we've all been silent. And so I just have this feeling, so conversation is starting, and that is really good and really important. And I think once it starts, we have little holes in the dam now that are going to get bigger and bigger. I think that conversation, I sort of feel like there's a lot of bad, problematic narratives that still have some hold in the universe of discourse that I exist in, mainly just because we haven't been talking. There's misinformation, et cetera. So the more, I think we have some catching up to do and thinking, ethicist, I want to think through ethical dimensions of things. I think we have some work to do to be as good about thinking through the moral complexities as we should be, given who we are. And we're getting there. I have noticed something of a generational divide with, I think, some people who are not in line with the magisterium, nevertheless adhering to more of the justification paradigm again, where we're not very comfortable with abortion, but we think that it should be allowed sometimes, and we have to figure out when that's okay and when it's not. And maybe younger people in the world that I operate in being more like, it's all about women's agency. Women can make those decisions. They're able to do that moral discernment. That's not an absolute. It's just a trend that I've noticed. And then the final thing I'll say, and I'm not keeping track of time at all, so please stop me, is, okay, that conversation that is starting is really powerful, and people want to stop it. And the example that I will give is that we, in my department, we're doing a series called Feminist Ethicists Respond to Dobbs. So we're having this semester, every 2 weeks, we have one talk with one of our ethicists, either on faculty or a recent graduate or somehow affiliated with Loyola and our theology department, talking in some way about implications of Dobbs. And in most, we have varying viewpoints among us, but nobody's happy with Dobbs. I'll put it that way. Everybody's raising problems. And in the first session, I found that from the Q&A, first of all, and some people that came up and talked to us afterwards, that even though the speaker was pretty clear about where she was coming from, we were not very legible to a lot of the audience as feminists who were questioning Dobbs in a theology department at a Catholic university. They couldn't quite believe we were who we said we were, and so they were like, "Are you really?" And that was weird. So I mean, it was telling. It was telling that we could be that clear and not legible. I was the second speaker, and so I opened by just laying it out there and saying, okay, I want everybody just to know where I'm coming from. I think that women are always able to make these decisions, that terminating can be a good decision, that continuing a pregnancy can be a good decision. And there was a contingent of Students for Life there that day with sort of crib notes and talking points, who were asking questions that had nothing to do with my talk. And one of them decided to call me a heretic. And our posters started coming down from around campus, and that's not surprising to me, but as I was reflecting on it, it was just like, wow, they really don't want us to talk, because when we talk, everything's going to get way more complicated than they want it to be. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Professor Peters.
Yes. So just to go back, the question was, what have I observed about or heard from church folks about how they are regarding the repeal of Roe, and what challenges are facing Christian communities going forward? So I want to answer that in two different ways. So I'm currently, you introduced me, you talked about my sabbatical project, which is a project on abortion and religion. And I'm working with a research team of colleagues. So I'm white Protestant, I have a Black Protestant colleague, a Jewish colleague, a Muslim colleague, and a Roman Catholic colleague. The five of us are interviewing women and people having pregnancies, having abortions from those five traditions right now across the country. And so from listening and talking with and collecting the stories of Reformed Protestant women, I've only interviewed women so far, white and other not Black Protestant women, it is very striking what I am hearing from them about how this is affecting their lives. So many of those we've been doing, we collected for a year before the Dobbs decision, and we have continued to collect since the Dobbs decision. And so, there's been a radical shift in accessibility and the way in which people are able to access abortion care. And we added a question to our interviews after Dobbs, which is, what would you have done if you hadn't been able to get to the clinic that you got to? That has been a really telling question. So we're mostly have been collecting in North Carolina, and abortion is still legal up through 20 weeks in North Carolina. And there are more and more people coming to North Carolina now to access care. We also have just in the last couple of weeks started getting people from Michigan and Illinois, and most of those people are actually not from Michigan and Illinois. They're people coming to those states for care. And the it's just so distressing to hear what people are saying. So some of them are saying, well, I would have gone somewhere else, right? I would have found a way. But many others have said, if I couldn't get care either, in North Carolina, some of them drove over from South Carolina, I probably either would have tried to self-manage my abortion, or I just would have had, and mostly it's another child, because most 60% of people having abortions already have one child. Many of the interviews we're doing are people who often have an infant, and the spacing around childbearing is also a huge piece of this that is often not really recognized or given enough consideration around the struggles that people are already going through to care for the children that they already have. And then just yesterday or the day before, the last interview I did, the woman said, well, there's this woman in my town who has 6 kids, and she said she would take it if I couldn't find a place to go. She was in South Carolina, and there's something profoundly disturbing from a Christian perspective that values family and care and what I'm going to talk about in a minute in terms of covenant relationship with our children, to think that if the state is forcing me to have a child and I can't care for it, I will find someone in my town who can take care of that child. And this is, there is something inherently noble and respectable about people who choose to place children for adoption, but that should never be something that anyone is forced to do because they cannot afford to care for children that they bear. And so that's a huge piece of this around sort of what I'm hearing from Christians who are having abortions. And I only have a minute left, so I'll just have to answer the challenges that I see facing the Christian community going forward. With just to say, and I've been saying this a lot lately when I talk to churches and groups of Christians, yes, legal access is important. It's vital. We need to fix the problem that we have right now. But if we were to reinstate Roe v. Wade tomorrow, it would not change one thing about the culture in this country that led to Dobbs. And that is, the justification frame that Sandy, referred to, that I'm happy to talk a little bit more about. But that justification framework that shapes how we think and talk about abortion, we have to work on long-term culture change around how we think and talk about abortion. Not as something we do after we address the legal issue. Those have to be things we do simultaneously.
And that is a perfect transition to our final pre-prepared question. Again, I'm going to ask each of you to speak for 5 minutes on this question. We know that conservative Christian voices dominate anti-abortion activism, but instead of dwelling on how you think they get things wrong, can you share with us a theological perspective that you think supports the reproductive agency of pregnant people? And appropriately enough, we'll get to start with you, Professor Peters, and then we'll move to Professor Kamitsuka, and then finally to Professor Sullivan Dunbar.
Thanks. So yes, I will pick up where I was, where I just left off. And this was a hard question for me because I think it's a good thing that there are so many ways we can go with this. There are so many theological arguments and positions and ways of thinking and talking about this. The title of my book, Trust Women, I could talk about Eve as moral decision maker and the whole foundation for trusting women. We need to talk about new ways of thinking ontologically about gestation and what happens during pregnancy. But the one that I want to focus on is what I think is really helpful coming from a Reformed perspective, and that is recognizing motherhood as a moral choice, recognizing parenting as a covenant relationship. In our baptismal vows, our baptismal formula, Rebecca Todd Peters, child of the covenant. When my dad used to get mad, my dad was a minister, he would always say that. He would say, Rebecca Todd Peters, child of the covenant, to remind himself of his relationship with me before anything happened in how he was going to reprimand me. And that is part of the sacredness of parenting, is that we are bound together with each other in this covenant with God and with our community. And that is sacred. And this whole, again, what I love about reproductive justice is putting pregnancy and decision-making about pregnancy back where it belongs in the whole scope of people's sexuality and reproductive lives. As we think about, when can we parent? When are we able to parent? When are we able to care for children in the way that they need to be cared for? That partly that's economics, but partly that's also just about community or partners or support networks and other factors in your life around your housing situation and your job situation and other factors that relate to what it means to be able to be a good parent. And so recognizing that parenting requires so much of us, and that is, when we talk about healthy families, we need to recognize and affirm the challenges of gestation. I mean, it's not easy to bear a child, but also then it's not just 18 years, right? It's the rest of their lives. They are this little piece of your heart out in the world that you are connected to in very deep ways. And so I've had 2 abortions and I have 2 children. And I often say the decisions that I made to have those children were far more significant moral decisions than the decisions to end pregnancies. They were all moral decisions. They were all decisions that it was appropriately responsible for me and my husband to make together. But much more significant decisions to bear children and to raise those children, and to be part of that covenant relationship with them.
Thank you very much, Professor Kamitsuka.
Okay, I've just got to start by saying amen, Reverend Peters, on that. So I'll just continue right along. So I think that the most important theological claim that I can make that supports the reproductive agency of pregnant people who are also church folks is this: it is possible to have an abortion Christianly. Now, this is a very different claim from saying that the believer who wants to have an abortion is permitted to have an abortion under certain circumstances that the church delineates. This is also different from saying that the believer who has an abortion can be forgiven and readmitted to the church in good standing. So no, I'm saying something completely different here. I'm saying that the pregnancy-capable believer has the moral responsibility to manage their own reproductive life. And this may include, and for a majority of women, it does include abortion health care. The pregnancy-capable believer has this moral responsibility because they are the ones with a uterus that can carry a pregnancy. So according to Christian teachings, everyone has to give an account of their actions before God. The Christian is therefore required to use their God-given moral conscience and make their own ethical decisions. This is not optional. This means making ethical decisions about how one uses one's uterus. If the believer decides upon serious reflection that terminating a pregnancy is the best decision for their life, then that is what having an abortion Christianly means. Another way of saying this is that the basis for the moral authority to decide whether or not to have an abortion rests with the body that God created with a uterus. If God wanted biology to control destiny, then God would have put uteruses in a non-sentient type of human creature. But that is not the way that creation went. Uteruses reside in the bodies of moral agents who have the responsibility and the authority to determine their use. So in saying this, what I'm laying out is a theocentric argument for moral authority, not rights. Appealing to rights is what one does in public-facing arguments made in a democratic society that runs on a consensus about the importance of human rights. And RJ makes these kinds of very important claims. But rights and moral authority are not the same thing. Now, one advantage of an argument based on moral authority is that one never faces a conflict of competing rights between the pregnant person and the fetus. The pregnant person is the one who holds the moral authority by virtue of being the only one God ordained, and I use that theological term intentionally, the only one God ordained to manage her uterus and its contents. The fetus does not have moral authority over her, nor does any proxy for the fetus have that authority. So the ability to see a fetus inside a woman's uterus by virtue of a sonogram, for example, does not give anyone the right to pronounce on that fetus's fate. So to force the woman to have an abortion or to force her to have the baby, either way. So to give a very weak analogy, my ability to see inside your living room window does not give me the right to point my universal remote at your TV and change the movie that you're watching on Netflix just because I think it's offensive. Now, I'm not trying to be glib here. Having an abortion is not a nothing burger. It is a significant moral decision. It means ending a developing human life. But one does not need to invoke personhood language to acknowledge that developing human life has value. But making decisions about that life belongs to the person who would have to gestate it, birth it, and parent it. For some, that decision comes very easily. They know instantly they want the baby or they don't want the baby. For other people, it's a more agonizing decision. It's different in each case. Either way, when one looks at pregnancy from the perspective of a doctrine of creation, in the way I've just been doing very briefly, the pregnant person is the human creature who holds the responsibility and therefore the moral authority to use her God-given conscience to make that call.
Thank you. Very well said. And Professor Sullivan Dunbar will give you the last word on this one.
Thank you. And in some ways, I just hear a lot of echoes of what I want to say and what Teddy and Maggie have already said. But I'm coming from a Catholic framework, so I'll talk about it in a slightly more Catholic way, I guess. And that's an odd thing to do for many people, of course, because we all know what the Catholic Church officially says about abortion. But I guess what I want to say is that there are two things at the heart of the Catholic moral tradition that I think are very directly connected to reproductive justice. And one of those things is the centrality of human moral agency, which is what I hear Maggie and Toddy talking about, and practical reason. And we have a deep and rich virtue ethics tradition that involves people learning to make wise decisions throughout the course of their life over time by considering lots and lots of different factors, including what they're capable of, what their desires are, what responsibilities they have, who are they in relationship with, all sorts of decisions. And that could be about where to go to college or whether to go to college. It can be about whether to bring a child into the world right now. That is central in Catholic tradition. Our moral agency is the way that we image God. And the other central factor that's related really is the common good. The common good in Catholic thought it's sort of the central principle of Catholic social ethics. And it says that the common good exists where every human person has the prerequisites of flourishing, of full human flourishing. So that can mean, basic material things, housing, food, shelter. It means education. It means room for artistic and spiritual opportunity, everything that a person requires to live a fully human life, that we were created to live in a community where everybody has the prerequisites of that. And in fact, that if you don't have it and I'm in community with you, then I don't have it either because we're so deeply connected. And so in that framework, first of all of those prerequisites of flourishing, to me, offer a very strong parallel to, again, when reproductive justice, the paradigm talks about everybody having the right to raise their children in a safe and healthy environment. That means that the children have the prerequisites of flourishing and the people raising the children also do in the community in which it's happening, and that the community has a responsibility to help provide that to the primary caregivers. And it means that when women are exercising, or pregnant people are exercising their their agency basically to decide, am I going to have a child right now or not? They're doing that because everybody's moral responsibility is to in some way contribute to the common good. And they're basically saying, is this a way in which I am currently going to contribute to the common good? Which includes my good. It's not all, it's so because of that interdependence I talked about. It's about picking up responsibilities, which is something I sort of said in my first answer about economics. It's about choosing and discerning what we're doing with our lives and how that fits in with our own discernment about our own lives, and how we can promote flourishing of our other children, which come up so often. And this is the kind of reasoning that pregnant people do when they're deciding whether to have an abortion or not. We know this from qualitative studies. They're considering, is this what I want right now? Can I do this right now? What will be the impacts on me and the other people that I care for, etc. That is not how the official hierarchy draws on Catholic tradition to talk about abortion. They turn to absolute moral norms, and there's big debates in Catholic moral theology about whether we should go with absolute moral norms or not. I'm just saying, and many have pointed out, like Christine Gudorf and many others have pointed out, that the church draws on different aspects and methods in its own tradition to deal with things like social issues and war, for example, than they do with sexual and reproductive ethics. I think that we have a rich heritage to draw upon to talk about women's moral agency and pregnant people's moral agency and pregnancy decisions. It would be very threatening to some people for us to make those the center of our reproductive ethic, but I think that's where we should go. So.
Thank you so much. This has already been a very productive conversation, and we've had some great questions and great answers and great exchanges. We're now going to move to some questions from the audience. So here's the first one. And Professor Sullivan Dunbar, I'm going to address it to you for reasons that I think will be obvious. Are there economic theories that operate out of altruism and self-sacrifice in the public square rather than the privated domain?
I don't think so, but I have a hard time even sort of fully processing the question, I guess, because maybe I'm so imbued in economic theory that runs on self-interest. And so I'm not really sure what that would look like. I mean, there are theories of how the state should interact with the market in order to provide goods to everybody. But I don't think I have a good answer to that question. I suspect that there are others in the audience who might have a better answer than I do to that question, but I'm sorry that I can't give a better answer to that question.
No problem. Yeah.
That, Ellen? Yeah.
Yeah. Go, Toddy.
Yeah, I would not say altruism and self-sacrifice. So I would also say I don't think those are healthy for the care economy either. And I think, Sandy, you might have things to say about that too. Sort of what are the positive ways to frame the sort of care economy. But I do think that the solidarity economics movement is an alternative movement of economic theory that's rooted in non-capitalist ways of thinking and organizing our economy. So rooted around mutuality, rooted around provisioning, and rooted around sharing or other ways of making sure that the common good is really the framework for provisioning rather than profit or sort of the traditional kinds of market-based organization. So that would, and you may want to comment on that, Sandy, too, but that would be sort of something that I would suggest.
Sandy, please go ahead if you have comments.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy mentioned Nancy Fulbright, who is a wonderful economist, but she's still working in the paradigm of sort of self-interest, but then she also wants to work in how we would value care and find a way to sort of compensate care in a money economy is how I understand her. So she's kind of operating in a model that at least doesn't marginalize care, but still is operating in some ways on self-interest. So I think that what Tati and Jeremy, some of the resources that they're offering are probably more what the question is getting at, but I'm not sure. So
I have an opportunity to follow up with that. One thing that occurs to me, and I'll just pose this as perhaps a way to reflect on these different answers, has to do with really how we value care. And, so oftentimes, we, as you said, I think, Tati, right, care is unpaid, the work of care. But even when it's paid, it's very low paying work. And I'm thinking both of childcare workers and then also of nursing home aides and that kind of thing. So I wonder if there is not also an underlying issue here that goes deeper than self-interest, that goes to a kind of bottom line conviction that we should be able to take care of ourselves and we should be independent from one another, that runs exactly contrary to the solidarity model. And which is one, and maybe that is one reason. I wonder just if you might reflect on that as something that makes the solidarity model particularly potent.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight, Ellen. I think that, it's really hard to pull apart the sort of basic root argument around sort of homo economicus, sort of the individual independent person, as the framework and the foundation for particularly this sort of late capitalism that we are in the midst of now, that has taken all of that to an extreme. And it certainly is manifests in a particular way in the US, even more so than other capitalist economies in Europe or neo-Europes and other places too. But, and this is directly related to how we think and talk about abortion and childbearing and the position that people are put into when they are making decisions about particular pregnancies. So, and I think that Maggie referred to this earlier, as much as I want to make sure people have access to abortion care, I don't want anybody having an abortion that doesn't want to have an abortion because they can't afford a child. That is just as egregious as forcing people to bear children for the state. So I think that you're really digging into some of the deep ways in which capitalism shapes the current context for how we are thinking about reproductive decision-making in this country.
Thank you. Any thoughts from the other two panelists? If not, I have another question to pose. So this one is also, I think, interesting because it also gets at a deeper structural dynamic that is that's at work in these debates. And the question goes like this: it seems that a major pillar of Christian anti-abortion discourse is a wholesale embrace of not only the capitalist, but also the heteronormative prioritization of the nuclear family as the primary social, economic, and moral mechanism of intergenerational care. How much do our panelists think that the concept of the nuclear family is a problem for thinking theologically about reproduction and relationality? And to the degree it's a problem, what concepts should the nuclear family be replaced by in Christian theology? And Professor Kamitsuka, if I may start with you, Maggie, on that one.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the way I think about this, and this is more from a historical perspective, even though I'm not a historian, I agree that the nuclear family is invoked in Christian anti-abortion discourses, and it's used in a certain way to set up an image about what the ideal family is that should always welcome babies, right, that come into being. I'm not so sure that the nuclear family, though, is the crux of the problem. I think that there are deeper things underneath the nuclear family, and these would be the big isms of like patriarchy or misogyny. Probably even misogyny would be the deepest one, because even if you look at experiments in American history of utopian communities that tried to do away with nuclear family structures, they were still highly patriarchal and misogynist. So I'm not sure that sort of rejiggering the nuclear family necessarily gets to the problem that is deeper than that, which is patriarchy, and then sustaining the patriarchy is the misogyny, the basic distrust of bodies that are different from the male body, and have a certain kind of generative power to produce new life, whether you call that a woman or whatever you want to call it. But these bodies that do things that male bodies are unable to do, that fear and then the misogyny that comes out of that, I think that's deeper than even the structure of the nuclear family, though it is important to address problems in the nuclear family with all of the relations to capitalism and heteronormativity and compulsory reproductive activities and so on.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't shake the heteronormative side of it as well, because I keep thinking about, another divide between more conservative theologies and more conservative Christian theologies and more progressive ones that really basically say the purpose of being created female is to give birth. And this happens you find this in Protestantism as much as you find it in certain Catholic circles too. And that leads also to the rejection of the idea or rejection of acceptance of gay families or queer families, right? Families who push against the heteronormative nuclear family kind of idea, even if they are intended to, they kind of modeled after a nuclear family, right? It might be 2 dads versus 2 moms. 2 dads or 2 moms versus a mom and a dad and 2.5 children, right? Living independently. And most typically, these are families where, to have children, they have to have some means in order to be able to do it, because they can't produce them together themselves in the same way. And yet that's also rejected. So I'm wondering about how that might play into the debate about abortion and, family values.
Well, if I could jump in here too, just to build on what Maggie said, because I think I 100% agree with what she said. I think that it's the patriarchy and the misogyny that undergird and have shaped the heteronormative nuclear family. That, that nuclear family is about women staying at home, caring for children, right? That whole traditional idea around what family should look like, that Ellen, you're absolutely right, that certainly not all queer families, but some queer families also then model. And there's so many ways in which that's damaging, right? It's damaging. But I think it's really important, as Maggie is saying, to go back to thinking about the ways in which that idea of that family is shaped by patriarchy and misogyny, because it's easier just to focus on the ways in which that shapes our culture today, the sort of focus on individualism and the need for families to be independent in an economic environment. And it's easy to not talk about the patriarchy and the misogyny that has shaped those ideas. And I just think we have to always bring people back to recognize how deep that hatred of women, fear of women, desire to control women, right? And then again, anyone, in a genderqueer frame, all of that goes back to the same desire around very clear gendered norms that are binary, and that have expectations with them. And that root is really the root, I think, that has allowed Americans across the country to sit back as these laws have been passed in our states. It is just shocking to me that people have simply sat back and let conservative Christians in state houses pass laws that they don't agree with. And I think it's because of misogyny and patriarchy and the Christian ideals around gender norms that are so deeply, deeply embedded in our country. And so again, I think this is one of the reasons that Christians need to be speaking out in very public ways about these issues.
And I'll simply add one more thing too. We've got to add racism into that mix too, because right, who has access to, I'm thinking about the cult of true womanhood, right? And that access to the pedestal was for white women and not for Black women, and Black families certainly continue to pay the price all along. So that too. Yes, please, Sandra.
Yeah, I was also going to mention racism and just say that I think that it's not just patriarchy that causes us to sit back and allow these state legislators to pass these horrible laws. It's also racism, and that in terms of family form and the nuclear family, we can both look at how alternative family forms and alternative caregiving networks have evolved in communities that have been extremely squeezed, I guess, by our stinginess in social policy. Like I'm thinking of Patricia Hill Collins talking about other mother networks and things like that. And also how our state has repeatedly tried to discipline that kind of alternative caregiving strategy and force people back into the unachievable nuclear family. And I'll just leave it there. So.
That's great. Another question from the audience. Can you say more about the most promising theologies of gestation that help make sense of the child who comes to be as a child of God without a life begins at conception perspective? Sandy, do you want to take that one on?
I can, but what I think I'll probably end up saying is that one of the most promising theologies that I've encountered is Tadi's. So it might be, I find Tadi's sort of and I will just say that I'm teaching her book right now, and my students were so excited that you were doing this today. The theology, well, I should probably let Tadi articulate her own theology. So I will, actually. I think that would probably be better just to
No, go ahead. I want to hear what you have to say, Sandy.
But now I have to trip over myself because it's been a while since I'm getting ready to teach that chapter next week. So the notion of pregnancy is a liminal stage, and it's different from not being pregnant at all, and it's different from having a child. And the sort of, instead of thinking of there being two sort of competing individuals involved that have rights bumping up against each other, the notion that the prenate, which I love your language of the prenate, because it's more neutral than like unborn child or fetus on either side, that the prenate status is is sort of an in-between status, and that ultimately and basically until that prenate emerges into the world, their status is secondary to the status of the mother. So I don't know how I did on that. You can flesh it out.
Thanks, Sandy. I think is that okay, Ellen? I think
yes.
I would expand on that. I think that the liminality piece is something that is useful for us to talk about because it really helps us mark what's unique about gestation. This is a sui generis experience in human existence, and we don't recognize that. And I think it's because we haven't had female theologians for the last 2,000 years who were getting pregnant and gestating babies. And the theologians didn't really think about or care about what was happening. And I think that there is, and Maggie's doing some of this work too. And I think that there is just so much room and space for theologians who can gestate babies to develop much more ontologically rich ideas and thoughts about what is happening during gestation. And I think that there's really helpful language from feminist philosophy talking about that when we, people who have had children, I have 2 children, when I was pregnant, those were very, desired and wanted babies. And we talk about those pregnancies and those prenates in proleptic ways, meaning we are calling them into existence before they are there. And there is, this is what we get in sort of that evocative language in scripture that talks about when I was with you, right? These are evocative ways in which we imagine the children that we hope for. We believe that God is with us during those pregnancies. We you know, and you know, there are also crises that happen up through birth and after birth, right? That the human condition is fragile. But when we recognize and think about the stages of development in a more sophisticated and nuanced way, it certainly allows us to recognize the fragility of life and the liminality that happens in those in-between spaces.
And that is the perfect transition to another question, much more a really difficult, emotionally difficult question. Any theological insights on how a miscarriage could be experienced as a devastating loss, while an abortion could be a relief, as well as other complex things? Maggie, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I want to talk about that, but I also want to tack something on to that last question as well. So I think the way, because it's related to the miscarriage issue as well. So in my sense, there's kind of taxonomy we can do. There are three different models to look at fetal status. And this affects how one thinks about abortion and also about miscarriage. The first one is that the status of the fetus is determined relationally. The person who is bearing that child has a relationality with that fetus, and to the degree to which that person covenants or recognizes, there's all different kinds of terms you can use, covenants or recognizes that they want to parent eventually that child, then that's what brings that child into being, and that moral value accrues as the pregnancy goes on closer and closer to the moment of birth. So that's a relational model. The second model is a biological model. And this says that based on what's happening in fetal development, that fetus acquires moral status irrespective of the relationality between the mother and the child. So in other words, a fetus that is a blastocyst has less moral status than one that has lungs developed and ready to breathe, that's viable, right? So there's a biological sense that moral status accrues as the biology develops toward viability and birth. Then the third model, I would call an ontological or a theological model, which says, if we start with the principle that being is good, this is an Augustinian point, that to exist is a good, then there is moral status of that being from the moment of conception that's not greater than or less than what happens. In other words, being doesn't accrue. It just is a good. That can also, that position is not an inviolable right at conception position, because it can come alongside a view that, as I talked about before, the moral authority of the pregnant person begins from the moment of conception, or at the moment at which they know they're pregnant, all the way through. And that moral authority does not go down as you approach birth. So in this third model, both of them are parallel throughout. In other words, the value of the fetus is the same from conception until birth, but the moral of the authority of the woman is also the same from conception to birth. It's not that as the fetal value goes up, the moral authority of the woman goes down. No, they both maintain alongside, and the woman or the pregnant person maintains the moral authority. Now, if you apply this model to miscarriage, it is able to answer the question of why is it that you can say we mourn our miscarriages of wanted babies, but that it's also okay to have an abortion, right? Because you don't have to say, well, there's a different kind of fetal status for the pregnancy that miscarried as opposed to the pregnancy that was unplanned and unwanted. So this is a way of ontologically looking at fetal status that affirms the grief and the suffering that happens when women, including pro-choice feminists, when they have miscarriages, And it also affirms the right to have an abortion whenever it's needed in a pregnancy. So that's a sort of a two for an answer to both of those questions, the question of fetal status and also the question of what's the difference between miscarriage and abortion, which is, again, not much.
Thank you for that too. Other thoughts from either of our other two panelists? Yeah, I think it is. I think also one of the things that would be important to observe too is that that even the decision to having an abortion, yes, in fact, somebody's observing this, that the model you're putting forward, Dr. Kamitsuka, also allows for mourning following an abortion, which does in fact occur, right? It's not that the women who have abortions do that in some kind of unfeeling or uncaring way. There can, there's always, it's going to be a mixed emotional response, I'm sure. Well, let's see. We may have answered all of the questions, but let me go back to look for one other thing. Is there anything else, Erin, that you see? Okay. Okay, we're good. Well, I think this has been a really fruitful discussion, and I hope it's been helpful for those of you who are in the audience. We're getting some very, very positive responses in the chat. Thanks for articulating this kind of understanding of prenatal life. One participant observes that they've been waiting their whole life to hear something like that, which is super, super helpful. And I think also everyone is expressing great thanks to all of our panelists for sharing their insights and their brilliance, and for doing so from such a compassionate and well-educated and well thought out perspective. Are there any other closing comments or questions? Panelists, anything you all would like to say to each other?
Well, I just like to say that I so very much appreciate Sandy's and Toddy's work in all of the various different areas. And I do appreciate them taking the lead on the economic questions, because my economics expertise doesn't extend far beyond my balancing my checkbook. So I appreciate that, and the opportunity to be here and talk about these really important issues at a time when, fear is rampant, and about people's future and their economic stability and so on.
That's very yeah. Go, Toddy.
I would just add my thanks and gratitude to the Winland Cook program and the invitation to be part of this dialogue and this important set of conversations. And thank you all for sponsoring them.
Yes. I would echo both of those comments and just say, Toddy and Maggie are kind of my heroes. So I'm really excited to be on a panel with them. So thank you for including me.
All right, that's great. Then I'll wrap things up here in a second. And what I would like to do is just invite you to join in the work that your communities are already doing, and to continue engaging in this issue of matters of religion and justice. If you want more information about work on religion and justice, please check out the work of our partners, as well as the work of the Winland Cook program at Vanderbilt. You can find that information at www.religionandjustice.org. And please be aware that on this website, at the address I just gave you, we will also be posting a blog series on reproductive and economic justice. That will be available soon. And we will also post there a recording of this event today. Already, some of you are asking about access to that. And then finally, we'd like to ask you to invite you, I guess, to sign up for our email list and to like us on Facebook. So thanks so much. And please do stay in touch and be well and be safe.